Welcome, everyone. This is the translations in considerations for translation panel. If you're in the wrong panel, you're stuck with us, I'm sorry to say. We are going to be taking questions on the Athos Discord channel. So if you would like to hear of anything, please post your questions there. We may not get to them right away, but we'll try to get to them throughout the panel. So to begin, let's have our esteemed panelists introduce themselves. And if we could please start with S, who unfortunately does not have a video camera feed, so you will be hearing her voice but not seeing her during this panel.
Hi, I'm S. Chiyi Liu. I'm a writer, editor, and translator. I mostly work from Chinese to English. So far, I've had a lot of short fiction translations published, mostly in Clark's World, although I have a few longer projects coming down the pipeline eventually. You know how publishing works.
Tracy?
Hi, my name is Tracy Canfield. I am not a translator of science fiction or other spec fic, but I am sort of adjacent to this in a bunch of other ways. My PhD is in computational linguistics, which is the use of computers to deal with human languages in different ways. And I had a bit of a specialty in machine-based translation. When I was in grad school, I also did French to English translation of things like contracts. And some of my own sorts of fiction has been translated into other languages, and I ended up working a bit with the translators on that. And I like to read fiction in translation. I'm like a lot of linguists, I read several languages besides English. But what I'm not is squarely in that bullseye of translating spec fic. So maybe I'll have some interesting theoretical things to chime in here. My game, iCyborg, a space opera heist, was published by Choice of Games, and I've had fiction in places like Analog and Strange Horizons as well.
Very cool. Rachel?
I'm Rachel Cordasco, and I founded the website sfntranslation.com, which tracks all of the science fiction, fantasy, and horror that is being translated into English and published. And I also translate Italian science fiction, and I've had a couple pieces in Clark's World, Future Science Fiction Digest, Samovar, and World Lit Today.
And I am Alex Schwartzman. I'm a writer, editor, and translator. My translations have appeared in FNSF, Samovar, Apex Magazine, and a bunch of other places. I also run the Future Science Fiction Digest, which Rachel so kindly mentioned. It's one of two magazines in our field that focuses almost exclusively on translation and international fiction. So we have slightly different focuses, but hopefully we'll talk about the business part of the translation and get to mention it again later. As a writer, I have a whole bunch of stories published in various short fiction publications, and my first novel, Eridanus Crown, came out last year. All right,
congratulations.
So, translation. Let's delve into this and sort of start with the basics. The most common and very annoying question that people ask writers is, where do you get your ideas? So I want to kind of riff on that and ask all of you, where do you get your sources? Like, where do you find things to translate? And in case of Tracy, what things should be translated and what should we be looking for? And if I may, I will actually start with Tracy with that, because her answer will be a little bit different, and then I'll ask her to translate.
Yeah, and I think this is kind of an interesting question since we can assume an English-speaking audience here, I think, that, for example, you see cases where there is sometimes some uncertainty of what a translation should be on the part of fans. So on the one hand, if you look at, for example, manga and anime that have very large English-speaking audiences, sometimes there are controversies about jokes that were changed because people assumed that they wouldn't be accessible, or material that was cut because they thought maybe it was a little too racy or controversial, or even just too specific. Where on the one hand, you have devoted fans who want this work rendered as faithfully as they can, and yet there is also a reason that it wasn't done that way in the first place. And in fact, maybe it wouldn't have reached a large enough audience without some of these compromises being made. There are in addition to translation, sometimes a certain amount of adaptation that's going on either for commercial reasons or just because of how close you were bringing work to the audience versus expecting an audience to take up something that is kind of foreign to them.
Okay.
Was that
But
for
as far as actually finding material, like for fiction, it could be anime, it could be fiction. Where do you think translators should look, or should they just solely rely on publishers to find the material for them?
Well, let me just take a moment to hope that I'm not being presumptuous by saying translators should do this, because the people I know who do, for example, a lot of literary translation are often very avid consumers of and avid readers in these fields. And so for them, it's almost more about noticing some work that they're excited about and saying, why hasn't anybody translated this yet? But where it's less because they are seeking out translatable works and more because they are sort of immersed in a literary tradition outside of the English-speaking world in the first place.
Thank you. S, what do you think?
So I think Chinese speculative fiction is really interesting in the sense that the entire Chinese expectations of publishing are very different than the US. So, in the US, which is where I'm based, so I can't really speak to other English-speaking countries, publishing takes a very long time, and there's a pretty intensive editing phase and all of that. But in China, that's not necessarily the tradition. You often have a lot of pieces that are published as web novels or just as posts in forums. And they often take off, and then from there, they're collected into a published volume. So in a sense, it can be almost harder to find Chinese speculative fiction because it's so decentralized. People can kind of post it wherever, and for me at least, I have to find things through word of mouth mostly, because the other issue with the Chinese web is that it's walled off literally from a lot of other web spaces. So you won't really be finding people from the mainland posting on Facebook or Twitter because they have to use a VPN to get there, and not everyone even knows that. So you have all these websites that are for the Chinese internet that pretty much outsiders don't really interact with unless they're interested in Chinese culture. So it can be very difficult to know how to navigate them. So I've ended up mostly getting my work either through for Clark's World, there's already a pool of pieces that Neil selected and wants them to be translated. But in other instances, I might make friends with the authors and have them recommend their own pieces or recommend some other work that they've enjoyed. So it can be very difficult to get into that network when you're first starting out.
And Rachel, you also translate from the Italian. So what has your approach been to this?
So it's been a little scattered at first. I've connected to a couple different editors in Italy who have sent me stories, and now mostly I'm in communication a lot with Francesco Verso, who started Future Fiction, and he has sent me a lot of stories that have already been that are by writers who are already popular in Italy, who have been published in Italy, and it's kind of like they've already been vetted once, and so he sends them their stories to me, and I get in contact with them and basically work with the author on the translations, and then I send them out. But the other thing is, it's good to look at other awards. Like every year, lots of different countries have awards for, best science fiction, best horror, best fantasy, and you can look at those titles, see what has won, and then either try to find a way to get those texts, or like Essa said, connect with the authors. One time I was reading an online kind of like Italian zine of fantasy and science fiction. And I liked one of the stories so much that I just emailed the author, and I said, you know, are you okay with me translating your story and sending it out to get published? And she said, yeah, you know. So it's very, it's kind of like, that's like the easy way, but there are a million other avenues. There's also the problem when the author is dead and you need to figure out the whole rights issues. But I haven't dealt with that yet.
One of the really interesting things about short fiction translation and genre in particular is that as translators, we do act essentially as editors, essentially as acquisitions editors, because we read all this material in the source language as fans. And just as Rachel described, we find stories that speak to us that we think would be really great to share with the audience in English. And then we may not be able to publish that story directly in most cases, but we're the ones who will go out and seek the rights from the author and then translate it and then do the entire kind of job, just like with our own fiction, of submitting it to magazines for publication. And what S has described is a little bit of a different approach, where an editor may find the story and then assign it out to a translator. But I feel like that happens a lot more rarely in genre short fiction than it does with novels or in some of the other genres. But segueing from that, I'm curious, when you do go through that process, what is it about the story? Talk to me about the balance that you, as a translator, when you select work for translation or you consider work for translation, what is the balance between the story being different enough to warrant being translated into English from its original language, but at the same time finding a story that can be translated? And are there stories that are just impossible that you've been wanting to translate but feel like they could not work in the target language in English? And I'll start with Rachel on this one and then go to S after that and then to Tracy.
I mean, there's, you know, I'm also probably less, like I've done this for a shorter period of time than Alex and S, but I have found that there's one story that I have sent around, and it, you know, it wasn't a question of being able to translate, like it, you know, the words were, it was pretty straightforward. It was just, it wasn't science fiction, it wasn't fantasy, it wasn't really magical realism, it was some amorphous blob in between, but I found myself really getting into it, and I really liked it, but I just knew it was going to be very hard to find a place for it, and I haven't found a place for it yet. And this was, I think I translated it about 2 years ago, and it's very long. I actually told the author to cut it down significantly, and he did, but it's still extremely long. So when they're very long and they're not kind of easily recognizable, I think it's hard to place them. But then on the other hand, I translated a story by Clelia Faris that has a lot of, she writes in Italian, but she also uses a lot of Sardinian slang and words that, you know, an Italian, someone speaking Italian wouldn't necessarily understand right away, or would have to look it up or something. That was pretty challenging, and I've had to kind of figure out how to, you know, first how to translate that, like from Sardinian into Italian and then Italian into English, in a way that then connects to what makes sense in English. You know, like, I mean, Alex and Eskin and Tracy can all talk to this. There's some, you know, jokes and some sayings that they have some kind of equivalent in English. You just have to find it. And if they don't have an equivalent in English, you know, you have to decide, do I just kind of bring it over and hope that people understand, or do I try to do something close to it? But Clelia's stories seem to resonate better. I've placed a bunch of her stories, and you know, and yet hers was much harder to translate in some ways.
Yeah, so I've got a number of different examples that I've worked on that address various aspects of your question. So funnily enough, although Liu Cixin is like the I don't even know what the word is to describe his status in China. He's like so revered as like, you know, the biggest name in sci-fi. But I find when I'm translating his work that I actually get a little bit bored because it's very much like your typical golden age Western Anglophone science fiction. You know, there's very much the same tropes of, you know, first contact and things like that, that I didn't actually find to be all that different from something like, you know, Asimov or someone writing in that kind of tradition. So while it is important to me, I think, to bring over his work, especially because there is work that deals with, you know, the Cultural Revolution in three bodies, so you do see his unique context. The way he delivers his narrative to me is not actually that groundbreaking from like a big picture speculative fiction tradition, you know? So I have other authors like Tang Fei. So she's, I've translated a couple of her things for Clark's World, and she has a novel length work that's kind of, it's a little bit hard to describe because it's like a collection, but it's interrelated stories. So I've been kind of pitching it as Lovecraft Country meets As I Lay Dying. So, you know, just this kind of idea of like a family narrative that's woven through various interrelated stories. And so I've translated one chapter on spec to send out as a sample just to try to get a publisher interested in it. And it's been a difficult pitch because on the literary side, it is already very much for Chinese sensibilities, just the way her language is, the way she evokes emotions. They're for a very Chinese sensibility. And like you would still enjoy it from an English reader's perspective as maybe like a magic realism type thing, but characters may often seem passive when that's mostly the Western perspective, you know? And so there are some elements of spec fic, but it's also very literary and slipstream. So it seems to have been a harder sell than some of her more sci-fi stuff. And then on a whole entire different front, I've translated my first novel translation that I've just completed is a thriller. So it's by Zhang Zhen, and he's been known in the Chinese web sphere for doing these podcasts like audio fiction. And so this is his first novel, and it's a thriller. It's not speculative. It's just straight up, you know, oh, who killed that person? How do we cover the crime, you know? But it's been interesting because I feel like I can be way more liberal with the translation, because in Chinese, the way you might express dismay is, you know, it sounds a certain way, but in English, you might be like, oh crap, what do I do now? And like, that's not directly the translation from the Chinese, you know, but I'm trying to capture the sentiment more than the actual words. So I've been very liberal there, but also because it's a thriller, you really need that pacing to be real tight for people to even want to keep reading.
Tracy?
You know, we touched a little on the question of whether things are untranslatable. And I think that what really convinced me that everything can be translated was seeing translations of Jabberwocky, which famously is full of nonsense words, where there literally is no equivalent to them. And seeing how translators in different languages had approached coining their own words for slithy toves that would have different sorts of evocations. I think that goes to something that you were mentioning a moment ago. If this has certain overtones that somebody who knows Sardinian would be getting out of this, what do I do to try to not lose that as I transfer this over to somebody else? I realize that translating computer manuals sounds like the driest and most awful thing in the whole world. But I think it's relevant here because of the combination of technical precision that is so common in spec fic, especially from the more sci-fi end of the spec fic spectrums. And the fact that often this is very engaging writing. If you take a book like Programming Perl, for example, it's full of references. It's from O'Reilly and Associates and is just a wonderful piece of technical writing. But if you compare it with the French translation, you'll notice that in many cases, they take things like, for example, some of the object-oriented stuff talks about a class reindeer and specifies it down until you get the instance of the class $Rudolph, the string reference Rudolph. And for an English speaker, you can immediately see how this is a particular instance of that class that has particular things. The French translator got rid of all the reindeer and just made it about camels because there's a camel on the cover and the camel is the symbol of the Perl programming language, and conveyed the technical information in a light and playful kind of way, but without worrying about exactly reproducing something that just wasn't going to resonate with people that are reading their technical documentation in French. And the translation is full of interesting choices like that, always constrained by, you have to be able to pick this up and use it as a reference.
Yeah,
I'm really curious. I'm sorry, go ahead.
Oh, sorry.
Oh, I was just going to say that's fascinating because I learned so much science from translating science fiction. Like, you know, I keep joking about it, but the Chinese language's approach to science and technical information is so clear that it makes English look absurd because English is absurd. But like, you know, things in Chinese, like the you know, scientific terms, because Chinese doesn't have that whole history of having Latin and Greek origins and influences on its language, all the terms are just basically in plain Chinese. And any everyday layperson can look at a scientific term and get the gist of what it means, you know, because you're using just the same terminology, the same words you would use in everyday speech. So it's been fascinating to see how when I look at something and I'm like, okay, I think I get this concept in Chinese, but then I realize I have to find the English term, which is very, very specific. So it's often a rabbit hole of, you know, going down Google and Wikipedia in 5 languages to switch back and forth until I find the English one. And then I have to educate myself about the science to make sure it is actually the right term. It is very interesting from a technical point of view, all these things that you'd think, since they're so specific, that it would be one-to-one, but it's actually very hard.
I have a really quick aside / follow-up for Tracy on this, because there's something that that you said made me think of this question. So since you've been working with programming manuals and such, in English we always use hello world as like the most basic program, something to type hello world onto the screen. Is
Yes.
there a different phrase that's being used in other languages for that?
You know, I believe that even specifically in programming Perl, they use salut tout le monde, hello world, hello everyone. And yet sometimes you start running into problems with this because often the individual words, if we call them that in a programming language, are English words that have been brought in.
Mm-hmm.
And so people will try to write their code examples so they're very readable. So what, if anything, can you do to alter the code examples as well so that they will make sense? And you see people even altering some of that technical material in an attempt to get across a little more of that, much like Hello World.
So
and variable names, like, you know, foo bar baz being the sample variable names that you always get in an English language text. You will have different sets of those. And of course, with the camera on me, my mind is just a beautiful, serene blank for actual details of that. I've read them.
You know, that, funnily enough, that makes me think about Pokemon names and the way they're translated, because Pokemon names are puns in Japanese, and sometimes the puns carry over into English and sometimes they don't. So in English, you make an entirely different pun. But since Animal Crossing has been all the rage, like the whole turnips being a stock market is a pun that works in English and is from the original Japanese, which is just fascinating to me.
Yeah, my kids have been getting into Pokemon past couple of months, and I've just not been, and I've been like, okay, I don't know anything about it, but then they keep talking about these names, and I'm thinking like, that's pretty funny. Like I actually get that name. I was starting to get pretty interested in it, but they don't want to talk. want to play their cards and do whatever. But
They learn without realizing they're learning.
yeah.
But Bulbapedia, which is the Wikipedia for Pokemon with Bulbasaur, Bulbapedia, they have at the end of each Pokemon entry a list of their names in different languages and often explanations of how it's a pun in that language.
That's interesting.
That's definitely worth checking out. In fact, I was watching an international TV show just recently that came onto Netflix called Into the Night, which is more of a thriller than a science fiction show, even though it has like a B-movie science fiction premise. But what's especially interesting, or at least it was to me, about that show is that the dubbing seemed to have been written by a completely different team of translators than than just the text that appeared on the screen. So if you were both listening and reading, you got two completely different translators. And sometimes the person who did the dubbing would do a really great job, and the person who who did the text didn't, and vice versa. So you could kind of pick and choose which phrasing you wanted to go with. But it's a really good class if you want to see how different, if you don't speak another language and you want to see how different translations can be based on the creative input of the translator. That's a pretty good show to just check it, to just tune in for like a random 15 minutes to check it out.
Yeah, I've got another example of just different translations. Just two quick examples. The first is Le Tombeau de Moreau. It's an entire massive book that has different translations of the same kind of Jabberwocky-esque poem. So I'll see if I can put that in the chat or something in a second. And then the second, there's a small zine called Chagwa Zine that every quarter there's one poem in Korean that multiple translators translate into English and put their notes in.
So that actually segues me to another question that I had prepared. There are challenges that are unique to the specific source languages, and sometimes they're linguistic challenges, and sometimes they are cultural challenges. As a translator from Russian, one of the most common reasons I get for a story rejection when I send my translations on submission is that the pacing early on is not fast enough, it's not interesting enough, it doesn't hook right away. And the reason for that is that the Russian literary tradition hasn't gotten to the point where the kind of established wisdom is that you must hook the reader on the first page. The Russian literary tradition is a lot more about sort of very slowly kind of immersing the reader in the world of the story before any action actually happens, and that has been troublesome in convincing some of the editors to publish the story sometimes, because they feel like the reader will not tolerate that. So I'm curious, since all three of you work with different languages, I'm curious if there are challenges like that that are inherent to Chinese, French, and Italian. So if we could start with S, and then Tracy and Rachel on this.
Yeah, I actually ran into this in my first Clarkesworld translation, the one I did with Ken Liu, Chimera. So the Chinese sci-fi tradition is very, very welcoming of infodumps, which the English sci-fi tradition has mostly, I guess, moved on from. But the Chinese, it kind of goes back to science education, right? So in China, there's a very strong tradition of giving people like a strong education in the sciences, and there's a whole Confucianist tradition of teaching as being a very important thing culturally. So these infodumps are not so much just to show off the writer's knowledge as they would in often in English, but often they are to orient the reader as well. So you can understand the coolness of the sci-fi concept once you understand the science. So that's kind of the perspective that the Chinese science fiction is coming from. But because a lot of English readers that's just not their sensibilities, their tastes. Ken Liu and I ended up reaching out to the original author and saying, hey, in this scene, it's a very, very long evolutionary biology lecture, basically. And we ended up kind of trimming it down so that it wouldn't be so bulky and like slow down the pace of the novella. because I mean the novella is already switching between scenes and it would kind of drag right there. So but that was something that we did with the, you know, the consent of the author. There previously, I think in translation tradition, there's often been not as much communication with the author, and a lot of translators can be more liberal about these things without really making it a conversation. But I think in now that we have the ability to communicate more freely with people like all across the world, I think we're seeing more collaborative work where people discuss the sensibilities on both sides and come to, you know, just some kind of compromise that might work.
Tracy?
But let me just briefly too defend the infodump, which I feel is just unfairly at this point in time. The fact that people will pay their hard-earned money for nonfiction, which has, the last I checked, no narrative whatsoever, or that they will buy an encyclopedia of a fictional world that is nothing but an infodump and might as well be called Infodump of Westeros or whatever, suggests to me that an entertainingly written, informative passage has nothing in it to put off readers, and that this is just a fashion right now, a fashion that I hope will go away soon.
I agree with you.
That it's one thing to have something that is dull or was something that is where you're waiting too long for something that you're anticipating, and another thing to say all of this fictional exposition is per se bad. I'm trying to think if I can think of a specific work, because when you brought up, well, what are these conventions in other languages? One that I thought of is third person omniscient, and I feel like I just see a whole lot more of that when I'm reading in other languages. And again, I'm not convinced there's anything inherently wrong with it, so much as it's become uncommon in English language fiction for a while now, and so it feels a little dated to people. But that's something where, you know, if you are translating that, you are losing something if you try to adapt that away. I think that that's gone beyond the task of the translator in many cases, to try to recast this information. And yet it's maybe not the way that people are used to reading English language prose right now, that they're expecting everything to be, even if it's kind of a tight or distant third person, to be seeing what the point of view character sees, for sort of evaluative things about the world to be kind of coming through that person's point of view in a way that is much less true in third person omniscient.
With Italian, you know, it's like close, and I mean, I've been, you know, telling people that when you read Italian, you can just kind of see a lot of the words that we have from English that are considered like the more, you know, the Latin kind of tradition in English. It's just kind of like right there in the Italian, and it makes Italian seem, at least to me, just it's very close to English in terms of just the kinds of things that are expressed. The kind of, even the pacing doesn't seem a whole lot different. It is a little bit slower, but the other thing in Italian is that, you know, with, you know, other Romance languages, with the verb coming, you know, in a different, you know, later, and the adjectives, and, you know, so it's kind of like basically you know, reordering them in a way that an English reader would recognize. But the one thing that I also have noticed is, and I think it helps that my husband comes from an Italian family, is that I've been translating stories, and these characters get into like an argument, you know, like between a father and a daughter, or between friends, and I'm going along. Sometimes I'll just, you know, skim the story. Okay, this is okay. Now I'm going to start translating it, and I start translating it, and I'm like, what just happened? Because they start having a disagreement. Next thing I know, they're like threatening each other, and it's like this whole, like, you know, like very it seems to me like very outsized kind of, like, this is a small argument. Why are you? I mean, it was literally like you know, a dad saying, no, you can't go out, and the daughter's like, well, I'm going out anyway, and it becomes this like this huge thing, and then I have to pull back and say, wait, you know, it definitely is a feature of some Italian, you know, I come from a Jewish family. We can get very, have very large, like, expressions about things that aren't necessarily that much of a huge deal. And so I've had to kind of decide, like, will this seem a little bit over the top if I translate it like, I'm going out, no, you're not. If you do, you're not my daughter anymore, and I'm disowning you. Like, you know, I tone it down, or, you know, and I try to come to some sort of to a compromise, but I also really let the original shine through. Like, there's a lot of threatening to not talk to people anymore over like a tiny little disagreement. And it's like, hey, if that's what people say, if that's what they're doing, I mean, it's not like it's not happening. It's just, you know, people might think, is this really what's, did they translate this right? It's like, yep, yeah, I really did.
Yeah, I encounter that a lot when it comes to Chinese fiction and sexism, because if I think people probably know that the second Three Body Problem book, so the second book in the trilogy, there were some changes to the content to kind of just adapt it for the sensibilities of English readers who were probably seeing some parts of it as sexist to the narrative. And so, you know, there are fans in China who were kind of questioning this, why this was done. But I mean, I believe it was done like all with discussion with the author. But it's a very big cultural difference the way gender is seen in China and the US, but what's considered acceptable to say, what's considered, you know, how people relate to each other. And I saw this a lot in the thriller I was translating, because the thriller is about a very wealthy, successful man who has 3 online friends, and they're all women, and ooh, twists and turns and scandal, you know. So you know, and like Rachel said, there was this one part when the wife so this woman is having an affair, and she goes to her husband and says that you know, they'll get a divorce. And in the course of saying that they'll get a divorce, she's like, you know, oh, please don't be mad, I'm just a terrible woman, you know, like like just something that seems very melodramatic in English. And I'm like, yes, it is melodramatic in English, but also just the expectations of how people behave according to their gender, how people speak. It's just a very different cultural background. So, you know, like Rachel said, there's some parts where I might like, you know, I might like smooth out some things, but in this case, I'm like, this is just the author's background showing through. I really can't, if I change that, I'm changing the author. So I just have to let it be out there.
I had to work on the project where some of the writing would definitely be considered very culturally insensitive in English, even though it was not meant but in any sort of a negative way by the author, nor it would be perceived that way by the Russian readers. But again, like the difference is that you know, everything happens within the frame of our cultural experiences and backgrounds, and so I worked with the author to make those changes to the English version of the text, because ultimately we wanted the readability of the text rather than the fidelity to the original. And I think it was Tracy who mentioned this earlier. It is indeed much easier to do these days because you can actually speak with the author and get their permission and implement changes like that. So we actually have a couple of questions that are coming from the audience, and I'd like to remind everyone that you can ask your questions on Discord and we'll try to address them. So Patty is asking what advice you guys might have for somebody who wants to start out as a translator. Would anybody like to take that?
My experience was probably not very typical in that I just emailed Ken Liu and was like, how do I get started? And he was like, you want to translate with me? So, but to be fair, I do honestly believe that translation would benefit a lot from a network of people who are willing to mentor and willing to refer people to others. And so I do genuinely offer for anyone who's interested in getting started translating, if you want to email me to ask or like talk about your situation, and I could try to connect you with people. I'll do the best I can, but beyond that, it also really depends on what languages you're working with.
Would anybody like to add to that?
I have such a non-generalizable background from being in linguistics, and so having people come to me and say, can you do this by this deadline, kinds of things that I don't know how somebody would try to follow in my blue footsteps on that.
My experience started with me loving the story, reaching out to the authors and just saying, hey, may I translate your fiction? And at that point, there's all sorts of technical things that we're not going to get into as far as what the rights are and how to work those details out with the authors. You're absolutely welcome to reach out. I would, if I may say that on our behalf to all of us, and get some guidance on that, because it absolutely is right that we need to work together to develop these networks and to have more wonderful fiction being translated into English. Magazines like Clark's World and Future Science Fiction Digest, and some of our are always looking for translations, so you can reach out to us as well directly and say, hey, I know this really great story. How do I reach out to the author? How do I structure this if I want to translate it? And we'll help you. But ultimately, you got to translate a story, and then you got to start submitting it as the same way that you would submit something that you wrote on your own, because unfortunately, just like with writing, when you're starting at the beginning, you gotta pay your dues and kind of go through the slush pile initially. And if your translations are popular and successful enough, you may start getting assignments or getting tapped for various projects in the language that you're working in. So we had another interesting question that I think Ash addressed it partially. I just want to see if people want to add to that. So I'll just read the question. So we have a translator who is working with Portuguese. And she was asking, I'm curious to know if you had some problem regarding character genres. As a translator who works translating from the genderless language to a very gender-oriented language, this is something that haunts me. And so I know that in Chinese, that's definitely an issue. So I would like to start with Ass on that, and then see if anybody else wants to add to that as well.
So let me see from a gender. So Chinese actually is not super gendered, not in the way Romance languages are. From the author side of point of view, like I write a lot of genderqueer characters and like non-binary characters who use non-standard pronouns. So I'm just like, oh god, I apologize to my future translators because I don't even know how I would handle it. but let's see. I'm just trying to go over the question. Yeah, I don't know. That's very difficult because also with Chinese, I do actually run into that problem sometimes in that Chinese is very prone to dropping pronouns if it's assumed that you understand who you're talking about. And so usually when I'm reading in Chinese, I'm like, oh, okay, yeah, it makes sense. And then I stop to write it down in English and I'm like, she, he, like, who am I even talking about? So it can be really difficult. And I think in some cases, I do just have to make an assumption and just be like, you know what, this writer probably intends this person to be he. But in other cases, I'm like, it might be worth it to open the dialogue with the author and just be like, hey, this is the choice I have to make. Do you have any preference? Do you have any guidance or any intent that you wanted to convey?
And building on some of this with the question too, with Romance's languages, that sometimes the other side of the coin of what you're talking about, well, I need to refer to this person and now I need to be more specific, is a text that is sort of deliberately withholding information in some way. Mm-hmm. Harold Pinter wrote a play and the first line of it is fat or thin. And the moment you render that into Romance language, well, are you talking about one person or several people? Are you talking about men or women? And in fact, that line is two people discussing one specific woman. But in English, the line sort of hangs there being just a little bit strange and ambiguous. And it's an ambiguity that has to be instantly resolved. This actually caused a plot problem in the translation of one of the Harry Potter books, The Half-Blood Prince. I read it for the first time in French in Strasbourg, and Hermione is going on and on about, how do you know the Half-Blood Prince isn't a girl? There was a girl with last name Prince, and it's like, well, because of what this person writes about themselves is how you know. This is not a misconstrued Hermione, French Hermione. I don't know. I'm imagining a translator just throwing up their hands at that one. But often there are clever and thoughtful workarounds people have.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, mine usually end up being very clever syntactic workarounds. trying to work the English so that I can, like, you know, do some like gerunds here and adjectives there, and then suddenly the pronoun disappears, and I'm like, yes.
I was translating one of Clelia Ferris's stories, and she's very I don't think she's doing it on purpose, but she uses a lot of male main characters, but then sometimes she'll introduce a female main character, but she just doesn't, it's very unclear, and the names are completely unclear. So I'm trying to figure out, so at one time I translated the entire story with the one character as a woman, and she wrote back and was like, translation looks great, there's just one thing, it's actually a guy. Oh, okay. It didn't make a huge difference. I just had to change he. I mean, it worked because this person it didn't really matter specifically. It's just that the name looked very, very, looked like a feminine name. I don't know. I thought I looked it up and made sure, but apparently it was a guy. So.
We have time for literally one more question, and this is one that is actually, I have a pretty strong opinion on, so I'll ask you guys first. What is your opinion of footnotings, in particular in fiction, not in nonfiction, obviously?
I think it's good to be very, very sparing. I mean, if you can. We had to footnote. There was a pun that was really important in a story because the title of the story was the name of the main character, but it was also a pun, and so we decided to do a little asterisk and a little, but not too much, just because people apparently a lot of readers are like, what a footnote, what is this, you know, so try to keep it to a minimum.
So I have different opinions on footnotes depending on whether I'm a reader and whether I'm a translator in that particular context. As a reader, I love Mark Z. Danielewski and Terry Pratchett, so I have no problem with footnotes. But as a translator, I'm also aware that footnotes do throw some readers off. And but it's another thing about adaptation, because different people in different contexts will have different levels of how much they accept footnotes. For example, if you translate something into Chinese, footnotes are standard. Like, Chinese just uses a lot of footnotes and is not shy about it. But in English, like, I really try not to footnote, because I just know that with the default English reader in mind, I just want it to be like as minimally invasive as possible. Like, I want to get their intention, you know? So if possible, I try to work things into the context, like saying, you know, her name was blah, 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 which shared the same character, which meant ocean or something, you know, like just working it in instead of footnoting it.
And footnotes can feel a little distancing, and they can break immersion, which is sometimes just so hard to build in the first place. Mm-hmm. But that's one reason to avoid them. On the other hand, sometimes they're kind of wonderfully informative.
Yeah. I feel like endnotes. Yeah, I feel like endnotes kind of are a good compromise to that, where you might not footnote things in the text, but you include an appendix. I think that's a good compromise.
Absolutely. For me, the you know, if a footnote is part of the story, the way that Pratchett did it, that's a completely different scenario. I mean, you obviously have to include the footnote, you know, as you're translating it and try to give the fidelity to the mode that, you know, the author chose for the story. But in terms of introducing our own footnotes, My answer to that is kill them with fire. I think I have a perfect record so far in my translations of avoiding footnotes at every possible cost, even if it means adding a paragraph to the story with author's permission, of course. I try to find every other solution before I include a single footnote. And part of the reason for that is that so much of short fiction is now consumed either online or with ebooks, where footnotes are a lot clunkier than they are on a printed page. So we have to be considerate of the modern way in which stories are read as well, not to mention audiobooks as well. So footnotes become much clunkier now that the fiction is being consumed in all of those formats. So we are unfortunately coming up at the very end of our time, so we can't answer all the questions, but we will try our best to answer some more things in Discord, whoever is available and willing. To close things off, if each of you could just maybe mention one of your upcoming translation projects or anything else that you would like to promote that's coming up. I'll start with S, please.
So my upcoming translation projects are mostly still in progress, so I don't really have news I can announce yet, but I do also edit a flash fiction and poetry zine called Arsenica, arsenica.ink. And I'm very open to receiving translations, whether of poetry or flash fiction. So if anyone's been looking for markets to pitch translations to, feel free to reach out to me.
Tracy?
Coronavirus has postponed but not canceled my forthcoming translation related thing, which was going to conventions to do a presentation on Harry Potter in translation, which is intended to be sort of a fun approach for people who are curious about the ways that people in different languages have approached everything from the puns to the neologisms to the just kind of layers of writing in Harry Potter in a in a way that is very accessible for readers who are often children and are not going to be very patient with footnotes. Coming to a con near you by the time we get a vaccine, if not sooner.
Rachel?
Clelia Farris's collection of stories, Creative Surgery, translated by me and Jennifer Dallaire, it was going to come out in June. Now it's coming out in September from Rosarian Press. And yeah, I think it's very exciting because I think she's great and more people need to read her.
And I'd like to mention that at 5 o'clock Eastern, I'll be doing a solo presentation on the challenges and the sort of a tug and pull between fidelity to the original text and fidelity to the reader, called Trader for a Living. So it's going to be a 50-minute long talk on that subject. So if you're interested, please tune into that. And Future Science Fiction Digest is at future-sf.com. I'll put the link in Discord in a minute. We publish almost exclusively non-Anglophone fiction. So some of it is translation, some of it are stories that are written by people who live in countries where English is not their primary language. So please check that out. Thank you very much. Whenever you guys want to dismiss us, and thank you very much for the panelists. It was a pleasure to work with you guys on this.
Thank you so much.